Shalom lekulam. Thank you for coming to the inaugural event of the Traf Lab, a labor perspective to human trafficking, ERC research project. I will get to talk much more about the project. I'm going to kind of hijack this opportunity and Jennifer's amazing paper to discuss it. So I'm not going to talk about it now. But without further ado, let me introduce you and welcome Professor Jennifer Gordon from Fordham Law School. Jennifer is, and she heard me saying that already, so I'll embarrass her twice. In my opinion, she's really the model legal scholar for anyone interested in combining social change and influential academic work. She established in 1992 the Workplace Project that since then served as a model for hundreds of other worker centers across the US and around the world. She won several prestigious prizes, including the MacArthur Prize. She was also an Open Society Fellow. She's the author of many groundbreaking articles and reports, as well as a really wonderful book, Suburban Sweatshops, that I recommend to anybody. So I'm really honored to have her here this evening as a keynote speaker in the first event of the research project. And following Jennifer's talk, we'll have a roundtable panel with Adriana Kemp and Yael Korlander, and I'll introduce them later. And then we'll open the event for questions and discussion. So Jennifer, thank you very much. And because we're taping this, if you can wear this, it will be good.
And can we turn these lights on and maybe that off?
Yeah.
Because your poor face was...
Oh. Let's see if I can do that.
I don't think this is on. It is? Okay. Oh, perfect. Perfect. And then can you turn on the... Thank you. Oh, that was short term. It's back. It's okay. I'll start talking and we can figure out the technology. Welcome and thanks to everybody for coming. I want to talk today about how to deal with the abuses that migrant workers face. And I think everybody is here because they care about that issue. But too often when we ask this question, we focus only on a very narrow lens. Even politically, leaving aside people who are struggling for migrant workers' rights, talk about migrants is as if we got migration only because of individual migrants. Because like in the media, news reports about a flood, an invasion of migrants, a flood of migrants, migrants taking our jobs. The rhetoric is like the only actors are migrants and they are doing something to us. And in fact, there are a lot of other actors in migration, and to figure out what happens and how to deal with it, we have to understand the whole chain of actors and actions that lead to conditions that make it easy to abuse migrant workers and that lead migrant workers not to be able to stand up against the abuse. Even when we widen the lens a little beyond the migrant to say the person who recruits the migrant or the person who employs the migrant, I still think there's too much of a tendency to think it's all about that relationship. And if someone recruits a migrant and charges them high fees or bribes or threatens them or makes a false promise to them, you're going to have a wonderful job, it'll pay 3 times minimum wage, we focus on how are we going to deal with that bad actor? How are we going to deal with the bad employer who cheats the worker? How are we going to deal with the bad recruiter who actually is a smuggler or a trafficker? And there are bad actors. There are bad recruiters who are traffickers, who are smugglers. There are exploitative employers. But I think that so long as we only focus on that one-to-one relationship and on the bad, somebody who's outside the system. It's an accident. They just happen to be a bad actor, and we have to make them a criminal. We have to punish them. that we're not going to be able to resolve the problem of the abuse of migrant workers, because the abuse of migrant workers is not only possible but common because of the whole context in which it occurs. And that context is what I want to talk about today. Stepping back even further, really the context of migration is an unequal world. A world where you could live in a country and earn 10 whatever a day, and that same currency, if you go somewhere else, you can earn 100 or 150 a day. And you know that, right? You know that because you have neighbors and friends and family members who've gone and earned. And that same world is the setting for companies that also know that, to move their manufacturing or move services that are mobile, like call centers, to move them to the low-wage countries so that the companies have lower labor costs and can make higher profits. In this globalized world, that's easy. It's easy for a company to move jobs to a place where labor is inexpensive and then ship the goods back over borders. And it's easy for a company to invest in another country because the kind of globalization that we have is globalization that lets money and goods move easily across borders. We have the World Trade Organization. We have global structures to make sure that money and goods can move across borders. And then we have people. And when people want to realize the benefits that they perceive in the difference between low-wage and high-wage countries, by moving themselves from their low-wage country to a high-wage country, they don't have the same freedom. They face restrictive immigration regimes. And that's where I want to start in understanding how the abuse of migrant workers becomes so routine. Because almost every high-wage country imports temporary migrant workers. And when they do that, almost every high-wage country requires that in order to get a visa, before you get the visa, you, the worker in your hometown, in your low-wage country, you have to have a job offer from an employer in the high-wage country, because your visa is going to be tied to that employer. And it's a reasonable question to ask how you, in your village, in a rural area where you want to migrate, are going to find that employer and get to that employer in the high-wage country, which may be a bordering country or it may be halfway across the world. And answering that question, which is a question brought into being by restrictive immigration law, right? It's immigration law rules that say you have to have a job offer before you can move. That has brought into being an enormous industry of, well, some people call it the migration industry, and it's a little too nice to say it's an industry of helpers, but it's recruiters, it's document processors, travel agencies, bus companies, document forgers who will make fake documents, immigration officials in the government who will process the documents. Think of the migration industry as everybody who comes into play as a low-wage labor migrant tries to get from where they are to where they want to go, assuming that they're going to go on a visa offered by the high-wage government. And the way that it works is really through a chain. So imagine that you have the migrant at the bottom. The migrant knows somebody in her hometown who knows somebody who knows somebody who has the offer from the employer for the job. And so the migrant speaks to that person, and that may be a teacher or a town official, somebody who's being paid as a broker for maybe a recruitment agency in the nearest large town. And that agency may have an agreement with a recruitment agency in the national capital. And that recruitment agency may have an agreement with an agency in the wealthy country. And it's the agency at the top that the employer has sought out. And all the way down, there are people who want and can ask for money. And you might ask, if migrants are earning so little or have access to so little income in their home countries, how can they pay everything that all these different layers ask? And the answer is that given how much more people believe that they can earn in a higher wage country, people are willing to borrow a great deal of money. And there are many, many more people who want those high wage visas than there are high wage visas. So it's a little bit of a bribery game. Whoever can pay what each of the agents at each different level is asking is going to get the visa. So even if you have to go deep into debt, you're going to do it because you believe you're going to earn enough not only to pay back the debt, but also to be able to send money home to your family, to start a small business, or educate your children, or take care of your sick mother, whatever it is that you need the money for. And so, unfortunately, for people who want to borrow money, in most low-wage countries, you can't just go to the bank and ask for a loan and show the possibility of a job to pay it back. And so what you have access to are informal money lenders. And informal money lenders give money to people who banks consider to be credit risks, and the price they ask is a very high interest rate. And they're connected to the recruiters and everybody else in the industry so that you know that in your hometown, there are people who, if you don't pay that loan back, can take, maybe you own your own home, maybe you have a car, maybe you have a share in a business. You have to put all of that up in order to get the money lender to lend you the money. And so migrants who are successful in the competition for visas, I almost would call it a lottery, but it's not a lottery because it's not chance. It's who can get the money to pay. If you're successful in that competition, then you leave for the wealthy country in a great deal of debt. And you carry that debt on your back. You arrive and immigration law kicks in again. And again, in most wealthy countries, what immigration law says is you have that job, migrant, so long as you stay with that one employer. If that employer thinks you complain too much, or you don't like the conditions and won't work as hard as that employer wants, that employer can fire you, at which point, in most countries, you become deportable. You have to go home. So from the perspective of the migrant who shows up on the job and discovers that the wages are a quarter of what she was promised, and that the hours are 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and that the employer is abusive and screams and yells, she faces a very difficult choice. She could protest, and she may, but she knows that if she does, that's the end of her earning ability. The debt she's never going to be able to pay, the loss of her car or her home or whatever else she's put up, and she has to go home in defeat. She hasn't helped her family at all. Her children won't be able to go to school and so on. So people are afraid to speak up, and they're terribly burdened by the debt that they carry. And this system, in my view, creates debt bondage as a matter of course, not as an accident or because there's a bad actor. The system as a whole, the combination of global inequality and restrictive immigration law for labor migrants, creates a structural context in which debt bondage is the rule rather than the exception. And so focusing on figuring out who's the small number of criminal recruiters or the small number of bad exploitive employers is part of the problem, But in a sense, it's beside the point. Unless we can figure out how to intervene in the broader structural factors, debt bondage is going to emerge from the structure as opposed to from the evildoer, which is the way most law that focuses on trafficking or forced labor is constructed. Catching the evildoer and rooting out the evil is not going to do it in this context. So what is going to do it in this context? So let me pause with that question dangling and take a step to the side and talk about another situation that I want to link to this structure in two ways. And that is the structure of manufacturing abroad, right? Coming back to manufacturing abroad. So it's very common to, when we talk about like the Gap or Nike producing shoes or clothes abroad, to talk about the way that comes into being as the manufacturing supply chain or the production supply chain, right? Is that a familiar? Okay. So that relationship is also the same kind of chain as I just described in migration. In fact, probably it's a more familiar chain. You have a global brand or a retailer like the Gap or Walmart or whatever at the top. Their job is not manufacturing. Their job is choosing products, negotiating for products, designing products, and advancing their brand. When they want to manufacture something, they hire, now we're starting at the top instead of the bottom, they hire maybe a design company and a market testing company, and then they hire a facilitator, for lack of a better word, who will deal with the manufacturing process. And that logistics firm or facilitator gets bids for the raw materials and also for the labor. And they choose companies that can provide the raw materials and labor on time, at a low price, in a convenient location for them. And increasingly, because wages are much lower, not in the high-wage countries, manufacturing for the past 30, 40 years has been taking place in low-wage countries. So the logistics firm hires a separate company often to do the stitching of the clothes or the shoes or whatever, and it's that firm that hires the workers. And this is a very convenient arrangement for the global brand because not only has it gotten lower wages, it has escaped the structure through which almost every country that I know about assigns responsibility for workers, which is who is the employer of the workers. That person, that entity, is responsible. But the global brand at the top doesn't employ workers. In fact, Nike, when it was first challenged because of the very poor conditions in the 1990s in factories in Vietnam, activists came to Nike and said, you know, this is, you should be ashamed. And the first response from Nike was, we don't make shoes. And that was remarkably honest. I think actually they make an image for their brand. They don't make shoes. But below that is the deniability that manufacturing somewhere else allows. The fact that Nike is not the employer and is in a country where its own nation's labor law doesn't apply and also is just far away. They can't see. They say, oh, we had no idea. It's not us. It has nothing to do with us. It just turns out we had a bad factory at the bottom, and we can get rid of that factory. And then you don't have to worry anymore. And that was after significant pressure, right, that Nike would say something like that. And it also creates, so it's deniability of legal responsibility, but also deniability of moral responsibility for a company like Nike or the Gap. We didn't do this. We don't employ them. We didn't know. And so the first thing I'd like to say is that we think of that as the product or the manufacturing supply chain. And I want to plant the image of what I described for migrant workers and recruiters as a human supply chain. And I want to talk a little about the parallels and relationships between them. The first relationship turns out to be that in many cases, the reason that an employer who wants to hire migrant workers is looking for them is because the employer is halfway down the manufacturing supply chain. So in order to compete for a contract to manufacture Nike sneakers or Gap t-shirts or whatever, and it's about the labor, you have to bid cheap in order to be competitive and win the contract. And often you have to bid cheaper than the local wage, the wage in the country you're in, particularly if you're manufacturing in one of the countries that's not the lowest wage country. And as a result, you look for workers outside of your labor market. So let me just give you some examples, which are all very recent examples in the past year or two. So Walmart decides it's going to put out a new bid, a new invitation for bids to provide the shrimp that it sells, canned, frozen, whatever, in Walmart stores. And in the United States, a lot of shrimp comes from Louisiana. And Louisiana companies, in order to be able to be competitive and get Walmart to buy their shrimp, start hiring workers from Mexico on a temporary migrant visa to produce the shrimp, right? So there we have the Walmart at the top down to the employer, and then the employer, under cost pressure from Walmart, jumps to the human supply chain to bring workers to it. Another example, Marriott Hotel, right? Marriott's a big hotel brand in Florida, in the United States, decides that it's going to save money by subcontracting out its cleaning services, which is also very common. You can chop off something you used to have as part of your brand and then put it out to bid. So it puts cleaning out to bid, and the winning bidders are companies that are bringing workers from the Philippines on temporary migrant visas. Again, Marriott puts something out to bid. Employers, in order to remain competitive at the bottom of the service supply chain, jump to the human supply chain to find the workers. And then finally, another example, Jordan, maybe closer by. Calvin Klein decides that it's going to contract with a company in Jordan to make underwear, and the Jordanian factory can't get that contract if it pays the Jordanian minimum wage. And so instead, with permission from the government of Jordan, it brings in workers from Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka to staff the factory to make the shirts. So all of those are examples of where the product or service supply chain intersects with, and in fact, I would argue, brings into being the human supply chain. And I think of these examples as the very heart of the global economy, where every aspect of production is reliant for profit on, well, let me say it a different way, where the decision to use, of an employer to use the human supply chain to get workers is a result of cost pressure from a brand or retailer in the product or service supply chain. So in the manufacturing supply chain for a long time, we also had the bad actor paradigm, and I just described it, right? Nike says, oh, we're so sorry to hear about those workers, or if you think about Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, one of the companies there says, oh, that's terrible, we had no idea, we have to clean that situation up in as small and least expensive way as possible. But In the manufacturing supply chain, over maybe the past 20 years, there's been a shift, at least a call for a shift, and a response of a kind to understanding poor conditions and low wages at the bottom of the manufacturing supply chain, not as the result of a bad actor, but as brought into being by the brand or the retailer at the top. In other words, a shift from a bad actor paradigm to an understanding of the structure. So that now I think many more people understand that the reason that hours are so long in global manufacturing is that brands, when they have a new fashion and they want to get it out right away, they demand turnaround of their factories, and the factories have the workers work more. And that the reason that wages are so low is that the contracts are put out to bid and companies bid to be competitive. And that brands, when they see that the jacket isn't selling and they realize that the fashion has changed and they want quick production of a new jacket, that they demand of the companies what the companies demand of the workers, that everybody work all of a sudden very hard around the clock. And that understanding has led to some success in getting consumers to pressure brands and retailers to take more responsibility. In fact, the result of this has responsibility in the name, right? The creation of an industry of corporate social responsibility, where brands promise that they won't use abused labor in their supply chains. And this is not what Eli asked me to talk about, and so I'll try and resist. But there's plenty to critique about that, and that's maybe evidenced by the fact that the most recent thing that I wrote is called The Problem with Corporate Social Responsibility. But I'll just leave that there for now and say that as problematic as it is, nonetheless, it has public traction. It's understood as a kind of moral or social or consumer matter that you have to hold the brand responsible for what happens in its supply chain. And so what I think needs to happen with migration, labor migration, is something similar. That is, we have to come to an understanding that the way that migrants are treated on the job is not the occasional result of a bad recruiter who we would label a trafficker, or a bad employer who we'd label a super exploiter, although those things exist. But in its most systematic way, it's the result of the structure of the human supply chain. And so if we're going to address that problem, we have to figure out how to systematically shift responsibility for those abuses up to higher actors. And in some ways, actually, I think this is more possible in the human supply chain context than the manufacturing context. For the reason, there are many differences between these contexts. I don't want to pretend to be claiming that they're exactly the same or the strategies can be exactly the same. But one of the differences is helpful for people who would have this approach, which is that in the manufacturing context, there is no international law that's capable of changing to say, Gap, you're legally responsible for the workers who make your t-shirts. Because there is no international labor law that has a strong enforcement mechanism. But when we're talking about the human supply chain, although recruiters are in the home country, the workers, the employer, and often the brand or retailer are all in the wealthier country. And what that means is that the legislature or the courts in the wealthier country can actually change the law to shift the liability regime so that you have at the bottom where the workers are being abused, a national law that says we can place responsibility for the way they were treated during recruitment on the employer that brought this recruiter in, and we can place some responsibility for their mistreatment at work on the brand that hired this employer. And so that's the idea. And as part of the work I've been doing on this idea, I've been working with an NGO, a human rights NGO in Mexico, to figure out if we can create a pilot program between Mexico and the United States that, without changing the law, which at the moment is not possible in the United States and also not possible in Mexico, if we can demonstrate that it's possible to do some of this. And what I want to do now is just show you a very short animation that we made that explains the pilot. And the pilot just launched 2 months ago, but you'll see the idea when you see the animation.
Today, the world's economies are linked in many ways. In the United States, for example, many employers turn to migrants to do low-wage work. Each year, the Temporary Worker Visa Program allows thousands of migrants, mostly from Mexico, to travel legally to the U.S. for seasonal work on farms and in fisheries, in construction and landscaping, and other similar industries. To get a temporary worker visa, a migrant has to have a job lined up. But how does someone in a remote Mexican village find an American business with permission from the U.S. government to hire temporary migrant workers? That's where recruiters come in, creating a labor supply chain. In theory, recruiters provide a service to migrants and employers, bringing them together so both benefit. But the reality for many migrants is brutal. Recruiters, acting on behalf of employers, frequently take advantage of workers, lying about harsh job and living conditions while demanding bribes in exchange for precious visas. Workers often begin their jobs under a mountain of debt and the threat of losing their homes, or worse, if they don't pay up. But they don't dare complain for fear of being fired, deported, blacklisted for future work, and having no way to pay off their debt. While workers lose out, recruiters line their pockets, and employers are happy to have a supply of workers who are too afraid to speak up, no matter how poorly they are treated. Technically, U.S. law prohibits these coercive practices and says a company can be held responsible for its recruiters' violations. Yet this is almost impossible to enforce because businesses are let off the hook if they don't know about the abuses. That creates an incentive to look the other way. And it's not just employers. Brand name and big box stores also profit from recruiter abuse. They pay less for products when their suppliers use temporary migrant workers who are afraid to stand up for fair treatment and pay. And while retailers increasingly are adopting codes of conduct that require fair treatment of workers and ban abuses by suppliers, they rarely know the full truth about what's happening in fields and factories. But what can be done? That's where Radar comes in. Radar is a first-of-its-kind tool that uses existing technology in a new way to put a stop to recruitment abuse in labor supply chains. It begins when migrants who experience abusive recruitment are able to report it confidentially to organizations they trust without fear of retribution. This information is added to the database, which traces the connections up the supply chain to employers and the brands they supply. Then, the project notifies the relevant employers and brands and suggests ethical and legal recruitment alternatives. It's all pretty straightforward, but the impact is huge. Businesses that hear from Radar can no longer claim ignorance about recruitment violations, making it possible for the U.S. government and public interest advocates to hold employers accountable under existing laws. Meanwhile, brands and retailers learn about worker abuses that previously were hidden, encouraging them to take action to keep their practices in line with public promises. The result? A powerful incentive for ethical recruitment from the top down. Radar is designed to motivate employers and make it as easy as possible for them to comply with the law. revealing abuses and simultaneously offering solutions. Best of all, the technology is low cost and easy to expand and sustain wherever recruitment abuse exists. It's a small investment that can help end one of the most widespread injustices in the U.S. temporary migrant worker program, and eventually in others like it around the world.
So, sorry. Just to conclude, I wish I had enough of the experiment of radar under my belt to tell you that it has been a smashing success. We don't know yet. We're trying. And I think in different contexts, the model can be adapted in different ways. But the key thing and the core argument I want to put on the table is we can't only focus. It's so satisfying as a human being to focus on the evildoer and think about eradicating them, criminalizing them. And it's much harder to think about harm that's created structurally. But the way that the global economy is currently structured does bring into being on a routine basis the kind of abuses that migrant workers face. And until we start to move responsibility for those harms up the supply chain, both human and manufacturing, I don't think we're going to see much by way of change. Thank you.